We're going to be talking today about seemingly Moraic onsets, the view from strict CV metrics. If we could move on. So basically, most people here will be familiar, most people watching will be familiar with geminates in general and syllable structure and Moraic theory, because it's basically become the lingua franca of phonologists in the world, representational phonologists, although it's something that we are recently challenging, obviously, Noam and I, in various publications recently. And one of the tenets of classic Moraic theory was that onsets were not Moraic, that in fact they couldn't be Moraic. And then there's been I'd say recent years, but when I say recent years, I mean recent to me, I mean like 15 years. So there have been recent moves, however, to argue that there are such things as Moraic onsets, most notably there's a whole little literature on it, and most notably, of course, Nina Topinci, who did a fantastic job of presenting the arguments for Moraic onsets, such as they are. Although we are going to be challenging that notion, because we don't think that the evidence actually stacks up for Moraic onsets. But the context of this is that traditionally Moraic theory did not admit Moraic onsets. So Drescher and Kay, for example, who weren't working in Moraic theory, but were just doing a typology of they were doing a parametric computational study of the acquisition of metrical systems. They took it for granted that onsets did not contribute weight to the system, to syllable structure. And a lot of the arguments that we're going to see for the presence of Moraic onsets, which I would say are probably, like, if I was to take the temperature of the field, I would say that they remain a little bit controversial, but most people think that Moraic onsets are a thing because of this recent research. And a lot of the logic that underlies it is actually based on the idea that, well, you can have things like geminates at the beginning of the word. And so if you're at the beginning of the word and you have a contrast like an initial geminate versus a singleton, then, well, you're at the beginning of the word, so there's nothing to the left, so you must be an onset. That's the logic. How else would we make the difference? And so every time you see something like this, people would say, okay, we have a geminate, it's at the beginning of the word, it must be an onset, so to make the difference between the two, let's give it a more. Okay, if we go to the next slide.
Right.
Now, the logic behind that is really a statement of how you see the world. It's a statement that words and syllable boundaries are coextensive. And what we will be saying is that that is not necessarily so. There is evidence from other areas of phonology that have not really anything to do with Moraic onsets. There's evidence from other areas of phonology that words and syllable boundaries are not coextensive. One of the most important pieces of evidence for this comes from Jonathan Kay's 1992 Do You Believe in Magic article, one of the best government phonology articles, I think Noam would agree, in terms of like the longevity of the paper and the wide implications that it draws. Jonathan Kay studies the behavior of S plus C sequences, things like star, strict, spoil, scathing, and sly, and so on. And these are, of course, fascinating sequences. And I think a lot of people know this, know that S is special. But it's special in a very distinct way because, first of all, it violates the clusters like star and strict and spoil and scathing. In a language like English, they violate the sonority profile that we would usually associate with onsets, because onsets are generally rising sonority, whereas S plus C sequences decrease in sonority very often, most of the time. And that's highly unusual for the beginning of the word. Another thing about S plus C sequences is that they violate the binarity of branching onsets. Branching onsets have to be made up of two members. The only exceptions to this are those that involve S. And so our choice really, if we believe that the S plus C sequence is if we believe that it's an onset, then we have to accept the structure that is shown here beneath, where you have an onset with three members. Thank you. So, so if we admit this structure, then we suddenly have loads of questions. Why is it only S that can be in the first position? Why is it that you can have any cluster after the S? And then what Jonathan Kay showed in his paper was that if you were actually to admit this structure, just because it's at the beginning of the word, so you have to think of it as an onset. If you were to admit the structure, you would be getting the phonological behavior of that cluster wrong, because S plus C sequences simply do not behave like branching onsets. And he goes through various arguments in that paper, which of course I'm not going to go through now, but you can read them. If you're interested in them. But the point is, they just do not behave like branching onsets. So since they are not branching onsets, they're something else. And one of the classic arguments was that, okay, well, maybe the S is actually just an appendix to the, sorry, if you could, stay on the slide for a sec. So that the S is an appendix. Meaning that it's not part. Actually, sorry, it's a good idea. Sorry, Noam, yeah, could you go to the next? So the idea would be previous. Next.
There's only these two. Okay.
Yeah, right. This one. Yeah. So the idea would be that the S would be an appendix attached to the word level, not to the syllable level. So it wouldn't be an onset. If we could just go back to the Portuguese. However, to say that the S is an appendix, which is probably the standard solution nowadays, because people recognize that ternary branching onsets are not a great idea. That meets a couple of empirical problems straight away. The first, and probably one of the best, is that that we have allomorphic evidence from Azorian Portuguese, for example, where we see this allomorphy between in and I with the nasal vowel. And in A, you see that the form that you get in front of a vowel has a consonantal n. Whereas in front of a singleton consonant, you get a nasalized vowel as the alternate. Now, things that are well-behaved branching onsets, they also, like singletons, take the nasalized vowel. And words that begin with S also take the nasalized vowel. This is crucial because we can't say that words beginning with S are in any way special just because they begin with S. But look beneath, words that begin with S plus C sequences, those ones that are problematic for our theories of sonority and binarity, those sequences of S plus C, which in this language gets pronounced as a sh, these take the in variant, not the in variant. Now, this is crucial because we cannot say that S itself as a consonant, its root node S, selects for in. It actually, as you can see, it could also be a nasalized vowel in front of an S. So therefore, we have to say that the special form of in that we get here can't be explained by the fact that that we're just in front that we're in front of the sibilant fricative, but instead you're going to have to appeal to its phonological affiliation, to its prosodic affiliation, because we can't put the explanation in the sibilant fricative itself. And if we do that, we could on the theory of the appendix, this sibilant fricative, if this is an appendix, is attached to the level of the word. So it's out of the way, you see? And so what you would actually have is an onset prosodically. If we could just go back one sec. So we would have an onset prosodically in this position. So the word, and since this is a singleton onset, you expect to get the nasalized variant if we're going by the prosody. So if we go by prosody, like syllable structure, then we would have to we would be choosing the nasalized vowel variant. If you go just by S or by the sibilant fricative itself, you don't know which way you can go, and so this is basically just a misprediction if you want to say that the sibilant fricative is in an appendix and it is followed by an onset. What Jonathan Kay proposes is that the S plus C initial words, which are of decreasing sonority, actually have the same syllabification as S plus C sequences inside the word. And if we could go to the next slide, and that what makes these words special is that they begin with a coda, a word initial coda. What looks like the beginning of the word is not necessarily the beginning of the syllable structure of that word. And so, as you can see here, the S would be located in a coda or the rhyme of a syllable that begins with an empty vowel. And so for Jonathan Kay, this accounts for the patterning of S plus C initial words with vowels, because those words have something in common. They have an empty onset. They are effectively vowel initial. I saw a hand.
A question
Carlos.
from Carlos, Shanti?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is because Portuguese and Spanish are practically or are very similar, but in those words, like inescapable, we have a vowel, right? Inescapable. And yes. I know that in European Portuguese, we have like certain elisions, so inescapable. And my question is, so if we assume that S is a coda, we should assume that there is a vowel before, even though there is not a phonological vowel, but a V position. That's the proposal.
Yes, and the idea is that if you lose that vowel in a pronunciation, it doesn't automatically become an onset. Like, it is still a coda. It's just that the vowel hasn't been pronounced. So yes, that's exactly the point. So the alternative, the idea would be that in languages like Spanish, you simply can't have this empty nucleus remain empty. So that nucleus must be filled by epenthesis. So you would get a stop or in many languages. So, so what this shows us is that the syllable boundary, the beginning of what we assume, the beginning of what we hear on the surface is not necessarily the beginning of our phonological structure. If we could go to the next slide, I'll show you like a nice secondary argument. I think this is deadly argument actually for S in the appendix. And you see, because the last ditch attempt is to say that S is in this appendix attached to this word level because you don't want to put the S in an onset. But the S plus C sequences, they have exactly the same phonological oddness and behavior in the middle of the words too. So if you consider words like monster, then if you say that S must be an appendix, what you're saying is that it's attached to the word level. But notice that here you are having to attach this so-called appendix X through a foot. It's in the middle, nested inside a foot. And you're saying that this S would want to attach here at the level of the word. This is a supreme violation of strict layering. And it's I have yet to, and I've asked this to various people that support the appendix idea, and I have yet to find somebody who supports the appendix idea who's happy. I'm not saying that they agree with us, but who are happy that the S would be an appendix in the middle of a foot. Now, the interesting thing is that this terrible structure is produced just from this idea that S has to be an appendix. You would never assume that this S is an appendix in the middle of a foot if it wasn't for the fact that it starts at the beginning of the word and it isn't an onset. So maybe just the beginning of the word is the mistaken part of this analysis. And if we could go to the next slide, Jonathan Kay says, well, that's exactly what it is. There is a uniform syllabification of S plus C sequences. The thing that's different is that the thing that's different is that at the beginning of the word you don't see the empty structure, but that actually words like stop begin with an empty syllable, with effectively with a coda S. So the take home here is that just because you are initial doesn't make you an onset. I know there's more you can talk about. There's so many more things we can talk about. We could talk about the fact that here you have to get istop in Spanish, and here you're allowed to have an S in Spanish. You could talk about the fact that in Italian these structures here are not allowed, so you get desto and so on and so on. There's lots of things to talk about, but that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're here to talk about today. But what this shows us is that just because you are word initial doesn't mean that you're an onset. And that's crucial for us because the German, the Moraic onset account takes almost basically for granted that just because you're at the beginning of the word and you're a Germanate, you must be an onset. Okay, I think I'm going to hand over. Do I hand over to you now? No, yes.
So, yeah, so now after Shanti gave you the take-home message of syllabification is not what you hear, right? So that we have to get rid of this simplistic view. I'm going to take you to another angle to another preliminary issue that I think is important for the understanding of Moraic onset. And that's the issue of the open secret of OT. And you're familiar with OT, so I'm not presenting this in detail, but the question is, how is universal grammar, the thing that we're all born with, expressed in optimality theory? And the usual answer, the answer that I teach also, is that the way universal grammar is expressed in optimality theory is the constraint set. The cool idea, the basic cool idea of OT is that all languages have the same constraints, and all languages have the same candidates, because there's a thing called generator that generates the same candidates. And the only thing that's different between languages is the hierarchy and the actual inputs for learning the hierarchy, because they're different in every language. The input is different for babies. So yeah, the universal grammar is the constraint set. So for example, this is an example I give in class. You get Catalan and French, and you get the same underlying representation, Taliban, from Arabic or from English or some sort of language we're not sure where it comes from. And then you have the same constraint, no nasal vowel, no N at the end of the word, and something about preserving nasality. And in Catalan, you get the no nasal vowel on top, and you care less about preserving nasality, so you'll get taliba. But in French, you can have a nasal vowel, so you get rid of the N, but you nasalize the vowel, so you get Taliban. So this is basically how languages are supposed to differ, right? However, there are many structures that have to be ruled out before the evaluation. Let's take an example. It's an example that I came up with. So suppose we have an input ba, right? And we assume these two standard constraints that says, well, don't insert moras, right? But then again, all vowels are supposed to be Moraic, at least all lexical vowels, right? So basically, if we allow there to be a candidate such as B, namely a candidate with a vowel that doesn't have a mora, right? Given these two very normal constraints, right? So the star non-Moraic V says, well, vowels should be Moraic, right? And Dep Mora says you can't insert vowels. And because vowels are Moraic, then you can't have moras in the input because that's something that the grammar is supposed to give you. So assuming that you have these two candidates and that constraints can be ranked and re-ranked, you expect that give the language on the right over here, which is the language, all of the languages according to most phonologists, can win, but also the language of the on the left can win because basically using the same constraints. And actually, if candidates can have non-Moraic lexical vowels, such as candidate B, then non-Moraic lexical vowels can exist with using very standard constraints. But we know that this kind of, at least in Moraic theory, this kind of the candidate B doesn't exist. So how do we rule it out? We can't rule it out if we allow gen to generate it, because once we generate it, we have like standard constraints will just give us some language that have this. So the answer to this, and it's an answer that surprised me when I talked to one of the chief proponents of OT, was that actually some configurations will never be generated as candidates. They told me that, and I was very surprised because I was not taught that. That's why I'm calling this the open secret of OT. Because once you say that some configurations will simply not be generated, well, you want to ask, well, how do you know what configurations won't be generated, right? And the answer to that is, well, UG will not give you some representations. So if we go back, right, UG will not give you candidate B. So gen is unable to generate candidate B. But and so now we're coming to this idea that UG is in fact not in the constraints. It's in what can be generated and what cannot be generated. So basically, there's the gen, the component that generates candidates, and then it goes through this black box that is UG, right? And the output of this black box cannot be candidate B. So that's why candidate B is completely unattested. Basically, you can only have candidate A for this input. So UG is not only in the constraints, it's also in this black box, right? But of course, people who do optimality theory not only they do not worry about what limits what a constraint might be, they don't even worry about what representations are generatable by gen. So basically there is this black box that has been completely abandoned. Now, one aspect of this black box is the study of possible and impossible representations. How do we know where to rule out an unattested configuration? In the constraints over here, or in the black box of UG over here, right? That's a question about your candidates. What are the legitimate candidates? Which brings us back to Moraic onsets, right? So we will be arguing today that this kind of representation in which an onset is Moraic is not generated by gen. So basically it's not part of UG, not because it's ruled out by some constraint, but because it's the black box there will not give you this. So what do we know about Moraic onset? They are a disputed representation, specifically because we are used to having Moraic consonants that alternate, that when they delete, they result in compensatory lengthening, because the mora, as you can see here, if this C deletes, then the mora remains, and that makes for the preceding vowel to be long, right? But this never happens when the consonant is an onset. So when onsets are lost, you never get, or very rarely, Shanti will talk about a case like that, a purported case like that. You never get lengthening when onsets are lost. And similarly, and that's something that we've never seen mentioned actually. Imagine that uh, onsets can be Moraic. Then we can imagine a Moraic coda being deleted, as in here. So the Moraic coda is deleted, but say the language doesn't like long vowels, so the next syllable becomes heavy because the mora is associated to the consonant. That simply never happens. Coda loss never makes the following syllable heavy. So there's much to dispute this type of representation. Moreover, even though there has been some work on Moraic onset, and as Shanti mentioned, the case has been made. In fact, there's a very, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, lacunary typology for Moraic onsets. They're very rare if they exist, and there is one language for which the scale that says an onsetless vowel is less heavy than a, well, not one language. It has been claimed that in some languages, onsetless syllables are lighter than onset full syllables. So CV is heavier than V. That has been claimed to exist, but other stuff has not been shown to be true. For example, a vowel, a consonant, well, there's something missing here also, another one. So say if both onsets and codas are Moraic, then we'd expect like CVC to be heavier than CV, heavier than V, and there's no language attested like that. Or we could expect CVC, the same thing here, CVC being heavier than CV, but CV being as heavy as VC, for example, because codas are also Moraic, and then everything being heavier than V. That hasn't been found. Or moreover, cumulative weight in the onset has also not been found, not been argued for. We'll see a case where it has been claimed that CC is heavier than CV, but in that language there actually V is as heavy as CV, so there's a problem, and there's a very bad trick that the author uses in that case. These scales are straightforwardly predicted by having the possibility of having Moraic onsets, and that's not the case. And moreover, as I said, it's a lacunary typology. Nearly all cases of Moraic onsets have to do with the left edge of the word, right? And all cases we have seen can be reanalyzed without Moraic onsets, and we'll show you a couple of cases like that. So we will be claiming, as I said, that Moraic onsets are ruled out by this black box over here, right? This thing that we study actually, and that OT people do not study, namely what is a possible and impossible representation. So we want to say that Moraic onsets are just an impossible representation. That's why they don't exist. They're not ruled out by by the constraint. So you can imagine if like Jen were able to generate Moraic onsets, to generate candidate B here, then of course you would have a constraint against Moraic onset over here, and then the dep mora constraint, and some kind of a hierarchy will always give you B, always let B win. This is not the correct hierarchy here, but you will have some hierarchy for which B wins. But we want B to be ruled out even before. It's not a possible candidate. Okay, so the roadmap for the test cases that we will show you today is I'm going to remind you a little bit about weight in strict CV metrics, and the 3 levels of stress in strict CV, and the Italian stress. We'll show you that. And then we'll get to a couple of other cases that have been claimed to have Moraic onsets. We'll do Iran Ossetian, we'll do Patani Malay, Samothraki Greek, and Umpi Thamu Moraic onsets, and we'll also see maybe go through a case of Brasilia languages that I'm not sure we'll talk about it, but we'll see. Okay, so strict CV metrics, we're reminding you this. Scher and Sigedvari show that if one assumes a strict CV skeleton, as you can see here, moras are in fact unnecessary, and instead only V slots, whether full or empty, are metrically significant. So a language like Latin, where you have facere, abere, arista, and dominus, actually don't need to be weight sensitive. Instead, what you can just say is that stress falls on the third nucleus from the right, nucleus -2, and when the final V slot, so when the word as in D ends in a consonant, then the final V slot is not counted. So dominus has the -2 V slot, and that's why it's stressed. Well, this works really perfectly, and there's nothing to say, but in fact, many languages are weight sensitive, even from a strict CV perspective. And this is what we talked about 2 weeks ago, or however many weeks ago. And that's how that's why Shanti came up in his dissertation with a way of doing weight sensitivity based on V slots and not moras, and using a metrical grid. The basic idea here was that contentful V's, like A and E in this example, project to L2, and then empty V's project to L1. And then, because empty V cannot maintain its projection, you have this process of incorporation, whereby the projection of the empty V over here is incorporated into the projection of the previous vowel. That's basically the equivalent of a Moraic coda with something. It looks like the consonant h here is adding the weight, but it's not the consonant. It's the fact that it's followed by an empty V that cannot support the weight that it carries. Yeah, so this is how syllables become heavy in this theory. And of course, so we've shown you that this also works for geminates. It also works for long vowels. Long vowels have a dependent V. The dependent V again cannot maintain its projection, and so the projection is amassed with the head of the long vowel, right? Basically, not a lot to say. Now to one of our recent papers where we attacked this notion of parsedness. And the test, the important test example, or there are actually two, is the case of Dutch, where you have a 4-syllable word composed of only CV syllables with stress, secondary stress on the first syllable and primary stress on the last syllable. There's a typo here. It shouldn't be gi but chi, but it doesn't really matter for this. So it's actually fonologie, not phonologie. Okay, but the point has nothing to do with the stressed vowel. In the analysis, on the traditional analysis of this word, there's a foot that is left aligned, fone, and there's the foot that is headed by the main stress. And that leaves the syllable lo as unfooted. There's no foot, that it's not footed. Why it gets realized is something else, we're not sure. But the idea is that the Moraic theory actually assumes that some vowels can be not parsed. Okay? and still get pronounced somehow. And the facts are interesting. The idea of the non-parsing is interesting because actually we see that this vowel, the dependent of the secondary foot, and the unparsed vowel behave differently, in the sense that you can say fonologie with the dependent vowel being reduced to schwa, but the unparsed vowel not being reduced, or you can reduce both, but you cannot reduce only the unparsed vowel. If you reduce the unparsed vowel, you have to reduce the dependent vowel too. And actually, the same thing is true in English in cases where you have, in English flapping, so in American English, in case you have two T's, both of which are unstressed. So in a word like competitive, right? You get two T's, tiv, both of which are unstressed. But according to a foot-based analysis, the first one precedes the dependent of the foot, and the second one is unparsed. And in a very, in parallel way to the Dutch facts, you get flapping, so weakening of the consonant before the weak vowel, or the vowel in the weak branch of a foot, and you can, and in that case, you don't really have to flap the T, so you can say competitive, or you can flap both of them, competitive, but you cannot flap only the second one, only the unparsed r. So you can't do competitive. That's completely out. So that leads us to a hierarchy that says the foothead is the stronger, strongest position. The foot dependent is the weakest position, and the unparsed position is actually between them. So Van Ostendorp analyzes it like this, saying that the O is some sort of also a head foot, and it creates a superfoot with the preceding foot. We're not going to go into the analyses here, but basically what we see is that the relationship between, or the hierarchy between the unparsed and the foot dependent is accounted for, because the foot dependent is a foot dependent, whereas the unparsed is a foot head, right? But the relation between the foot head and the unparsed is not so clear, simply because they are both foot heads. So why is one weaker than the other? Now, the really nice thing is that if we expand our syllable incorporation issue to feet, we actually get this thing. So for example, if you start out with phonologie, right? So this is the way things start. And then you have this stretch here of equally strong vowels, and you want to resolve that, and you do that through incorporation, as you can see in B. That actually, so you incorporate one projection from V2 into V1 in order to resolve this plateau. That actually derives exactly the attested hierarchy. So 1, 3, 2. The foot dependent is weaker than the foot head, and weaker also than the foot than the unparsed. The thing is, we don't have feet, because once we do this incorporation, there is no prominence problem. There is no plateau problem anymore. So we sort of derive this hierarchy just by assuming incorporation. And this is the important part. Weakness here is basically just projection to L1. After incorporation, you get this weakness. So this is about, yeah.
I don't know if I got lost, but why does incorporation happen? Because V1
because there is a plateau here. Yeah, because there is a
Oh,
plateau
oh,
here.
oh, oh.
Basically, why does footing happen, right? Footing happens in order to create prominence
Asymmetry.
imbalances, right?
Asymmetry.
So the same reason, right?
Okay.
So we have incorporation here, and incorporation derives the three-way hierarchy, right? In the foot
And then,
analysis, there's no, in the foot analysis, you can have feet, but you don't see why lo should be, so why this should be weaker or stronger than na, right?
In fact, sorry, and in fact, maybe you might even predict the opposite because you're
Yeah,
further away from the head.
yeah. So, Carlos, you wanted to ask something?
yeah, no, it's only that, okay, so we avoid the plateaus, and then let's say the algorithm needs to apply from left to right, and that's like a rule from Dutch grammar, or why
Yeah,
doesn't, yeah,
yeah. So
I
there
don't,
would be
yeah,
like
okay,
an algorithm applying from left to right or from right to left, and there's all kinds of
okay,
parameters there. There is a
okay, so I'm
paper.
thinking that, okay, yeah, like why we don't move 2 to 3, but that would create a stress clash or something, right?
2 to 3. Yeah, you don't want to do
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
That would create stress trash, right?
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
all those things are language specific. Yeah, probably.
Okay.
I have a
Okay.
problem with the cat here. Go away. Oh, okay. So this is one thing about weakness, and we keep that in mind because we're going to get back to it. And when we studied Italian, this is another paper, we looked at the fact that in Italian, basically the final vowel is very, very rarely stressed, right? And you get penultimate stress, that's the default stress, farina and dottore with lengthening. And you also get anti-penultimate stress that is less default, it's less common, but it's still there. You get pecora or dattero, right? And we asked what speakers learn about this difference, about why do we sometimes get what we get? What is the rule behind Italian stress? And we just use the same thing. We say final V slot projects only to L1, so speakers learn that the final V slot is weak, just like the derived weak uh, dependent, right? So the final V slot is weak, and once the final V slot, you just say, okay, we'll just stress the last L2 projection. So we start out with fa, ri, na. Final V slot is weak. And how do you stress the last L2 projection? By lengthening it. You add a CV, the vowel becomes long, and you do incorporation, you get farina, right? For a word like pecora, what speakers know is that lexically, also, the penultimate vowel projects to L1. All they need to know is that for some reason in these languages, you just cannot stress it, you cannot stress the penultimate vowel. Once they learn that, everything follows. You get pecora and you get dattero through incorporation. Just to show you how we use this weakness and
Can I just
how,
say,
yeah.
uh, in the paper we also explain why this cannot be accounted for using ternary feet and other mechanisms as well. It's not we have arguments against that as well from the word dattero especially.
So now we finally get back to Moraic onsets and the cases for which Moraic onsets have been proposed. So the first case we will see is actually kind of like the Latin case. So Irono session in 2024 was the subject of a paper by Lubera, or I actually don't know how to pronounce her name. Is it Lubera or Lubera? She's American. And what she showed is that this language has 5 full vowels and 2 weak vowels, and weak vowels and full vowels behave differently with respect to stress. You can see, for example, if you compare the singleton chapon for soap and over here what do you call it, the infinitive to fly, the infinitives to fly, to eat, to die, and this has nothing to do with the suffix of the infinitive, right? If the word begins with a full vowel, then that full vowel is stressed. If the word begins with with a weak vowel followed by full vowel, then you just ignore the first weak vowel. Over here, you also ignore the first weak vowel. So it's actually, there's a mistake here. It's not penultimate, it's peninitial. Stress peninitial weak vowel, right? However, what Lubera makes a big deal of is that when the word begins with a cluster, shk, and the clusters there are always sibilant plus something, then instead of stressing the second weak vowel, you stress the first weak vowel. So we get shkurin and shkufin. How come? If the general rule is to stress the second weak vowel if the first is weak, then how come in these examples, and notice that it's the same suffix, right? How come in these examples we actually stress the first weak vowel? And Lubera's conclusion is that clusters draw stress. She says, well, clusters are heavy. Therefore, this is like in a Moraic onset. Their clusters are Moraic. So she has, the cluster branching onsets. She calls them branching onsets. She makes the same mistake that Shanti warned against. And notice that this is an Indo-European language, and these are sh. So these are sibilant consonant clusters. So she makes that assumption that these are basically branching onsets. So she has this formalization that we're not going to go into, but basically she says if I have a CV syllable, then the consonant is not Moraic because there is this constraint that says in a CV syllable, the consonant is not Moraic. This is what she says. So don't have a Moraic onset if the onset is simple. And if the onset is a complex onset, then there's no violation of that constraint, right? However, so, this is not a great analysis specifically because this constraint really just does what she wants, right? And moreover, imagine that the ban on no simple Moraic onsets is ranked low, then we actually predict that there would be, a hierarchy like CCV over CV over V, or CCV is as heavy as CV. Basically, this makes bad predictions and uses a strange constraint. And all this is very unnecessary because all you need to say is that stress falls on the second nucleus in those cases. So if you have two empty nuclei, two weak nuclei, you just go to the second nucleus, and that's it. And the seemingly Moraic onsets or the branching onsets are just an S or a sh plus a consonant. They're separated by a V slot in strict CV. That V slot counts for the peninitiality, and therefore you stress the first weak vowel. It doesn't matter what comes next. So really, in Iran, Ossetian stress is not weight sensitive, and this is not a case of Moraic onset. Another case that can be explained as a Moraic onset comes from Umutina. It's a Brazilian language, and in this language, it is reported that stress falls on the more sonorant vowel of the last two, right? So A is more sonorant than O, A is more sonorant than E, so you say barozá and barisha, but ishazo and uase and oji, etc., according to the sonority hierarchy over here. If the two vowels are the same, then stress is final. So we're not going to talk about this sonority effect here, but what's important is that if the final consonant is a voiceless plosive, then the sonority is irrelevant. Then you always stress the last vowel, right? So one way of analyzing this is to say, well, maybe only voiceless plosives are Moraic, and therefore the last syllable is really heavy. And this is actually a little bit what has been more or less proposed for Piraha. And what Wetzel, so the people who wrote the paper that we're basing our data on, what they said is that they don't say that, the thing about the onset. They say that a syllable onset in the dependent position of a foot, so they need to have a foot, baki, or baki, so they need to rule out baki. So they say, well, that's a problem because we have a K in the dependent position of a foot, right? And that's no good. That's not good. So we shift stress to the right, and we have an iambic foot. Besides the fact that this has either trochaic or iambic feet in the same language, there is an alternative, namely to say that voiceless plosives are virtual geminates. In fact, they occupy two positions, right? Once they occupy two positions, then, as we said, stress is limited to the last two V slots. It cannot go any further. In the case of holobi, it cannot go to the O, right, to the first O, because it's too far away from the right edge. And in the case of the virtual geminate here, it cannot go to the A, even though the A is more sonorous than the U, because the A is outside that window. So another case where where onsets seemingly contribute weight, but actually they don't. I'll give the next example to Shanti.
Yeah, thanks. So one of the longest standing pieces of data for Moraic onsets comes from Patani Malay, dialect of Malay spoken in southern Thailand. And in this language, you have words without, the argument goes that you have words without initial geminates and you have words with initial geminates. The words without initial geminates the words with initial geminates, are largely composed morphologically. So there's a prefix, a b, which is added to the stem, and in many cases that prefix goes away, and there's a gemination that ensues at the beginning of the word. And the argument was that words without initial geminates have uniformly final stress. So they have final stress, matot, kada. Whereas words with initial geminates, they all have initial stress. And so the argument was, again, going back to that idea that if a geminate is at the beginning of the word, then it's an onset. The argument was, because they suddenly have initial stress whenever there's an initial geminate, and the language has no other clusters, by the way. This is the only clusters, the only real clusters. So the argument goes that it's the initial geminate onset that is counting towards the weight of that syllable, and therefore needs to be considered as heavy. So underlyingly, so therefore these onsets would become Moraic in Nina Topinski's analysis, And since they're Moraic, they can be heavy and attract the stress to the left. The argument's very simple. The data is very compelling, except for the data is completely wrong. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see that Burroni et al. This is, by the way, it's a fantastic piece of it's a fantastic case study for what Carl Sagan used to say, which is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the Moraic onset is an extraordinary claim because, remember before, it was never traditionally assumed to be Moraic, the onset. So if you're going to accept the Moraic onsets, you're going to need a lot of evidence to shift your viewpoint, or at least you should, because it's quite an extraordinary claim. It should come with extraordinary evidence. Well, it turns out some of that evidence is just incredibly weak, and some of it is just false. The Patani-Malay data we now know is false. We know this empirically. Burroni et al. 2024 in the Journal of the International Journal of Phonetics show that the purple here, the purple bars here, are the initial geminate words, and the words with just all light syllables are in yellow. And you can see that in terms of the duration ratio, and indeed actually for all other measures of stress that matter, there is simply no difference between the light words and the initial geminate words in either phrase medial, initial syllable, final syllable, phrase final, initial syllable, and phrase final, final syllable. So their conclusion is that in this language, there is never stress shift. The stress does not shift with initial geminates. You get an initial geminate, but that doesn't cause stress shift. What happened was field workers, presumably field workers, perceived the initial geminate as being more prominent, and so assumed that the stress was on the initial position. And when they wrote that down and they create that data set that we saw on the left, we get an incredibly compelling argument for initial onset geminates. But the fact is, it's purely from a misperception of the field worker, the field workers.
And then somebody like Nina Topinzi takes it and says, "Well, look, there is evidence for that." And then somebody else cites Nina Topinzi, like then Lubera cites Nina Topinzi, saying, "Well, there's good evidence that some languages have initial
geminate onsets."
Yeah. Moraic onsets, but where maybe Gen cannot even generate that, right?
Exactly right. So basically, you just you end up basically claims like that can enter into the literature, and then it gets cited, and there's a citations thing that goes on and on, which of course is legitimate and so on, but the strength of the data is weak for Moraic onsets is the point. And here's one example where it is totally non-existent.
I have to add to this, Shanti, that as I think I told you on the phone, I told Rashid Ridwan, who worked on geminates and knew the initial paper, right? I told him, look at this new paper that came out. It shows that this is completely false. And then he said he did not accept that it was completely false. He said, well, maybe it got phonologized or something. Stress got phonologized. It was even hard for him to
is no stress.
accept. Yeah. Okay.
But that's So thank you. Indeed, there is no stress here, no stress shift. And that's the amazing thing. Okay, should we go to the next step?
Yeah.
So, and I mentioned that because, by the way, Patani-Malay is one of the, like we were saying, is one of the oldest and most established pieces of evidence for initial Moraic onsets. Okay, another case comes from Samothraki Greek. Samothraki Greek is an interesting one because because if you recall, onsets were typically in classical Mora theory were not assumed to be able to be Moraic. And one of the main arguments for that was that onsets tend not to contribute to compensatory lengthening. So, of course, if Nina Topinzi, who's writing a book on and indeed collecting all the evidence she could, rightly so, on Moraic onsets, if you're going to try to make the case that Moraic onsets exist, you should expect that onsets will contribute to compensatory lengthening, because an onset could be Moraic, and then if you lose that consonant, you have the mora retained, and then you could get that lengthening. The problem is that there really isn't that much evidence for, so Bruce Hayes was right, there really isn't much evidence for onsets contributing to compensatory lengthening if you are rigorous about it. And it's one of those cases where we have, surely people would have to accept that when it comes to coders, there's no debate about whether or not they can contribute to compensatory lengthening. It's just manifestly true that they do. With onsets, we need extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if we're going to accept that onsets can produce compensatory lengthening, the argument better be really strong, at least not explicable in any other way. You'd have to say, like, we know this is an onset, we know it's a singleton, we know it's Moraic, and we know it deleted and created vowel lengthening. That's what you'd have to say. Well, that's not true. We don't think this is true for Samothraci Greek, because in Samothraci Greek, let's look at the data. We have an initial position, an initial R deletes. Historically, this is a diachronic process. So the R deleted in these words, and all of those initial R's produce words that have long vowels. So you might say, hey, this looks like an R, which is an onset, has deleted and lengthened the vowel. So it looks like an onset producing compensatory lengthening. Of course, it does look like that. And then the branching onsets, interestingly, the branching onsets also lost their R, and the result is a vowel lengthening in the position of that branching onset. So this is what we expect if we were saying that R as an onset has a mora, and then the deletion of that R created vowel lengthening. Now, in medial position, the medial onset R did not produce compensatory lengthening. And the argument here was that, the argument that Nina Topinzi makes is that the language has a high rank constraint that says R just cannot be an onset. So it's going to penalize any candidate that has an onset R. But you also don't want to create a long hiatus vowel. So this constraint here that goes S-LVH, this basically says you don't want to create a hiatus of 3 moras. And that's the explanation for why the R as a singleton onset doesn't contribute compensatory lengthening, but the initial R and the branching onset R do when they're lost. Now that's an analysis, okay? But there is an alternative analysis that we think makes more sense. Remember, this is a diachronic process, first of all. So the first rule is that, and this is typologically supported by studies of liquids in general, in many languages, liquids do not want to be, liquids want to be prevocalic. There's a slight mistake here. What this should say is R wants to be post-vocalic. My apologies.
Let's do that.
My apologies. Yeah, I could just type that in. So R must be post-vocalic. Yeah. So, and in some languages, this is true for all liquids. In some languages, it's true for all R's, and so on and so on. And the solution to this constraint that says that liquids don't want to be, the liquids must be post-vocalic, is to have copy vowel epenthesis. So in some languages, you get just a straightforward insertion of any vowel in front of the R. So you get things like ris becoming oris and things like that. But in other languages, you actually get a copy vowel. And this happened to the English Creole Saramacan, by the way. So just like if you take a word like bread here, it seems that the language had this rule that the liquids had to be found post-vocalically. Then we got we got a copy epenthesis of the vowel. This D also turned into an R. And so there was an intermediate stage where we get bread to berere. And by the way, this intermediate stage is recorded. And then you get the loss of R. Yeah, you get the loss of R just completely. And so especially, we have a rule here of intervocalic R loss. The R goes away, and it creates this very, very, very long vowel, which, by the way, notice has the stress exactly where the stress was in the original form.
Maybe it's a trisyllabic sequence. Who knows if it's a long vowel?
We know from someone that the native speakers consider it to be trisyllabic.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So the so indeed. This stage of this condition that says liquids must be post-vocalic, and then a stage of copy vowel epenthesis coming in, and then the loss of intervocalic R, like in brada, barara, ba, like this, is what we argue happened in Samothraki Greek. So rema has a non-post-vocalic R, just like protos has a non-vocalic R. The argument was, so we proposed that there was copy vowel epenthesis, and then the loss of the R producing a long vowel. And in this theory, we have a ready explanation for why there was no vowel lengthening in the intervocalic context. Because in the intervocalic context, there is a vowel to the left. So you didn't need to have copy vowel epenthesis. And so what happened is you didn't have that copy vowel epenthesis, you just lost the R. And so you just have a hiatus sequence. So like we were saying, could you analyze Samothraki Greek as being onset-driven compensatory lengthening? Yes, you probably could. But do you have to? No. And so if this is the evidence for onsets producing compensatory lengthening, we would say it's not sufficient.
I'll also add to that both this analysis and the Iron analysis use constraints that are just ad hoc constraints to rule out the thing that is predicted that doesn't fit the analysis. So the assumption is, okay, we could just say that there is a constraint against this thing that we're predicting to be. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
The last case that we're going to talk about is Umpithamu. Actually, one of the most famous cases of Moraic onsets comes from Topinzi and Nevin's 2007, analyzing the language Arente from Australia, and showing or arguing for data, like using data that is very similar to what we're using here, but more complicated. Here, there is really, it's a very straightforward case that can be argued that, you can easily go to Moraic onsets there, right? So let's just look at this.
Sorry, Noam, do you mind?
Yeah.
Do you mind? So the usual language that people will be talking about here is Aranda, which is this language here, this thing here. But Noam and I, we have spent a lot of time with Aranda, and with the arguments of Aranda and stuff. And the problem is ultimately the data. There are too many confounding factors, and you cannot reach a satisfactory conclusion about which analysis is better than the other because of the confounding factors. The data is just missing. It will not give us the. So Noam had this great idea of saying, let's do the same thing, but with a language that doesn't have the crazy confounding factors. And that's how we got here.
And maybe another, just to follow up on what you were saying, another issue about the Topinzi and Nevins thing is, again, the data, there's a big part of it devoted to rabbit talk, right? Which is something that like a language game in Arente. And then the data is based on a really hard to read paper that nobody has, and I'm sure Nevins and Topinzi, I know that they don't have it, and they cite another person, and Nobody actually looked at that paper, and when I got a hold of that paper, I saw that it's very hard to understand, and it has very little information. So in the end, Arente is really just, there's not enough information. On the other hand, Umpithamu, I know by chance I met the author of this I mean the linguist that worked on this language, and he wrote a dictionary and a grammar, and this is what I worked on, and I worked with the. I mean, I looked for confirmation from him, but he actually Verstreite actually wrote a paper about this issue. And he shows that in this language, initial short vowels seem to be extrametrical, right? So look at what's going on here. In A, you see that when a word begins with an initial short vowel, stress is final, okay? And when the word begins with a consonant followed by an initial short vowel, stress is on that vowel, right? These are A and B. Those are disyllabic word. You can see that in the final example in Taipan, we get koloji. So actually, what Verstraete really shows is that stress is penultimate in this language. It is penultimate in koloji, it is penultimate in kata, and it is penultimate in kalin. But it's not penultimate in ikan. And so what he says is, well, stress is penultimate, but initial syllables with short vowels are extra light. That's all he says. He doesn't talk about Moraic onsets. He just says that those are extra light. But if they're extra light, what goes on with them? Why are they extra light? Right? So somebody might come up with an analysis like this. Okay. Penultimate stress is imposed by non-finality plus a line right of stress. So you get and then you stress only heavy syllables, namely only syllables that have an onset in the Moraic onset analysis, right? So you stress in ikan, the second syllable is heavier than the first one because the first one doesn't have an onset. And in the second example over here, all syllables are equally heavy, and you want to stress the right, so you want to align stress, but you don't want to go too far away from the right edge, so you do koloji, you do penultimate stress. In Kalin, it's basically the same. We would go to non-final vowel, but you are stressing a heavy syllable, that's okay. And in Uku, because the vowel is long, then it's heavy already, right? So you are stressing the heavy syllable in all cases. So basically, by assuming Moraic onsets, right? We're assuming that onsets add weight to their syllable. We can derive the fact that initial onsetless syllables with short vowels are ignored by stress. But as we said, we don't want we don't want onsets to be Moraic for all of the reasons that we already showed. It's just that it gives very bad predictions, and it obliges one to use constraints that are ridiculous and are ad hoc for the purposes of the analysis. So really, what can we do? Can we look at it in another way? And this is what we tried to come up with. So what if the learner does not have the possibility of Moraic onsets, right? So it's simply not a candidate that their grammar will produce. So then maybe instead of asking, well, why are onsetless vowels weak, right? There is no reason that onsetless vowels should be weak. I mean, there is no reason that they should be weaker than full vowels. You could say, well, why are the ignored or the weak vowels, why are they onsetless? So again, instead of saying I have an onsetless vowel, right? Why is it ignored, right? And then say, well, because consonants are Moraic, that's not an option. So they could say, well, why are all of the vowels that are ignored, why are they always onsetless and short, right? And as we saw back in the beginning of the talk, there is a way of formalizing weakness, namely projection to L1. So now they know that initial vowels project to L1. That's a generalization about the language. That's something they learn, and they make the generalization about their language. Then this means that the initial vowel will be, in a way, extrametrical, just like the Italian that we saw. So here's what's going on. Initial vowel, it is weak because, and the reason that it is onsetless is because it's weak. Why is it weak? Because or how do we formalize the fact that it is weak? It's because it projects to L1 only. And that's why it cannot have an onset. Only vowels that project to L2 may have an onset. And we saw that. We saw back in the examples from English and from Dutch that onsets of weak, or specifically from English, onsets of weak V's are weaker. And here we just have to extend this to say, well, the reason that there is no onset is because the vowel is weak. That correlates. Now, if the vowel has an onset, then it's not weak, right? It perforce is not weak because our generalization is that onsetless vowels are weak, and therefore we get a normal vowel, and then we stress the penultimate L2. In koloji, we stress the penultimate L2. In uku, that has a long vowel, well, we could say this vowel is a regular vowel, projects, or no, we could say, so the vowel is long, so it is weak, but it has a second position that also gives its weight. Once you have incorporation, then that vowel also projects to L2, and therefore it is the penultimate vowel that projects to L2. And the same thing in karimpa, right? Here, this is just a penultimate vowel, and the vowel before it is long, and this is perceived, at least by the researcher, as secondary stress, which makes sense because the L2 and the L3 projections are separated by a zero projection. So basically, there is no reason to assume, even for this maybe the most convincing case of Moraic onsets, again, as I said, it's always left aligned. Even in this case, there is no reason to assume Moraic onsets. There is no need for Moraic onsets. We don't have a conclusion to our slides. But this is the conclusion to our slides. There is no need for Moraic onsets. And basically, if you believe that, and it's not a question of believing, say, if you look at the evidence and you say, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and there is no extraordinary evidence here. Their predictions are false. The tools that we need in order to support this analysis are ad hoc, and there is so much that is wrong about it. And for every case, there are alternative analyses. So do we need Moraic onset? Maybe Moraic onsets are one of those things that are simply not produced by gen, or not possible as part of what humans do. Shanti, you want to add something?
And that follows from our strict CV theory, because weight in our theory is an empty V. An onset is just a C.
Yeah.
So a geminate can be heavy. A cluster can be heavy, but a singleton onset cannot be heavy. It's just because it's just not definition in our theory, the theory of weight that we have will not make an empty onset.
Right. So remember our theory where we said only, and that's already in Sharon Sigitvari, only V slots contribute weight, right? C slots, so you can never have a C that contributes weight. It's just not possible. In that sense, if we are correct in assuming basically this, that Gen cannot give you Moraic onsets. I mean, we don't work with Gen and candidates, but because we work on this black box that OT has so valiantly left for us, if we are correct, then it follows from our approach that this is impossible because the only thing that counts for weight is V slots. It's never C slots. Okay, I think there is, as I said, there is no conclusion. It's just this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
There are some references here. So we have some time for, or not a lot of time for questions, but yeah.
Well, we have half an hour, so right now basically it's Ryan, me, Hugo had to go because of his internet provider, so we have some time. I don't know if Ryan wants to make you some questions. ¿Estás por ahí, Ryan?
Maybe.
Sí, pues sí, estoy aquí. Uy, no, pues gracias, agradezco mucho las. Oh, I can talk in English. For goodness sakes, the whole thing was in English. So I really like this, and the language I study. I have no real good reasons to propose syllable weight, really, but I do have these strange things that happen. Well, rather, I can't even, and also stress. I don't really hear stress. I think it's more sort of an architectural feature than a phonetic one. But I do get certain things happen with contour tones, which tend to only exist on accented syllables or on particularly prominent syllables. But in certain verbs, they happen on non-prominent syllables. You can have these contour tones. And, instead I've been poking around in the literature trying to sort of figure out the why. And of course, I've come around these Moraic onsets, and I was like, well, I don't want to propose moras just because of this bizarre contour tones that happen in unexpected spots. And they're always at multi-morphemic sort of areas. They're in these complex little morphological things. So I'm excited to be reading about or what you're presenting, because I think it gives me some more tools to talk about this in a way where I don't have to propose something I don't want. Or it's just, if I don't have good evidence for showing moras in general, then why on earth would I try to say it for onset? So it's helpful. It's nice to have a vocabulary to talk about this.
We're in complete agreement. We're in complete agreement about this. One of our main points is exactly that, which is that if the only thing you have is moras in your syllable structure, then you have to start talking about you see these effects with contour tones or minimal words or whatever it is, and you just assume, well, the thing I have to create that contrast is a mora, so I'll stick a mora in there. And it's a shame because, as you said, if there's no evidence for weight in the language, then this unit of weight is kind of meaningless. So yeah, no. What do you think?
No, so I'm thankful for the talk about this. Go ahead. No.
But people have tried to say very recently, there's a paper by Paramore saying that, well, we have these problems with moras that they actually not doing, they're there for for one reason, and then they're not there for another reason. So let's assume that there are moras everywhere, but sometimes processes ignore them. So this is not the way we would go. We would say, well, no, there aren't any moras. Well, no, we say there aren't any moras at all, but you know, it also leads to this proliferation of constraints about what you want, and proliferation about of I mean, in that paper, what's proposed is that moras are annotated for whether they originate in a consonant or in a vowel or in a sonorant or in a non-sonorant or something. Yeah. But for your contour tones, I know we know from typology that contour tones go on prominent syllables or long syllables, right? So they usually need two,
space.
Yeah, more space. Questions?
Right. And
go on.
No, yeah, I'm sorry to cut you off. Forgive me.
So, I mean, maybe there is some sort of length or prominence that is given by more space, right? And that's the prominence that you hear.
Yeah. So it only happens when the onset is a resonant. So if in these non-accented syllables, so if you have a resonant onset, you have pretty simple onsets. It's basically, just like a fricative stop and then vowel. But if it's, or just a resonant. But if it's a resonant and then vowels are the only ones where you can get these contour tones. Otherwise, the contour tone is split over two syllables. And so, yeah, but yeah, I mean, I haven't figured it out, like how to describe it in terms of what you propose, but I like it, and it's far more attractive to be able to say this. I had a draft. I just did a dissertation just a couple weeks ago, and so but my supervisor was also, he has this whole description of the Mazatec languages that sort of talk about moras, and he's like, well, these are Mazatec languages, and they're they're trochaic and more sorry, iambic, and this is what it's like. And so I was trying to do all these descriptions with moras and all of these processes, and it's like every process was just like complicated and then simplified and then complicated and simplified. It was this crazy long sort of description, and then I just decided, well, maybe there's moras, but I don't have to, and so I'm not going to. And it was one of those areas I had to sort of not add any sort of I won't want to say theological, but theoretical sort of commitment, like you guys are sort of trying to take down the onset mora, but rather it made everything, it simplified nothing and complicated everything. And so I just, mostly just because I didn't want to do all that, I just said everything is a syllable. That's the tone bearing unit. But this is, and I didn't discuss these odd contour tones outside of the expected spot that I'm talking to you about. But it's nice to have some more tools to be able to describe what I think is the same thing. And yeah, so the prominence, I do think that that resonant that I'm referencing is a different morpheme, right? And so that's my current analysis. And so for that, I mean, yes, there's some sensitivity. There's some weight sensitivity. Something is going on. So I definitely agree that. I just don't like having to call it about it as a mora. So to be able to talk about these weight distinctions and a similar syllable weight, with it's, at least it's helpful in my, it will be helpful in my description. So,
Shanti, do you have something to say about the fact that sonorants can carry tones?
Sure. I mean, like without seeing the language, one doesn't know, right? Like one needs to know. But it's compelling, I think, isn't it? That in some languages the only syllabic consonant that you're allowed is a sonorant, and in some other languages you are allowed upstream syllabic consonants. But languages that have but there are analyses out there, plenty of papers. So I would definitely point at, for example, Noam's written a paper on syllabic consonants in Yiddish. And in general, if those sonorants were syllabic, they would have a V slot. If they have a V slot, they have more space. They're a bit like a long vowel. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's
for sure.
I think there are tools. There are tools that maybe could, like you said, could be employed. Obviously, the specifics of the analysis you have to know the language.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose for me, I just want to make my primary concern is to describe the language and describe what I see well. And yeah, I guess I'm not too bothered if I make some things that typologically are going to be, controversial. As first, I want to understand the pattern, and describe the pattern well. And then after the pattern is described well and accurately, then I'll let you guys worry about the sort of typological issues. But that said, I think this sort of a proposition sort of simplifies some of the things. The contour tones don't actually happen on the resonant that I can hear, although it's difficult to figure out exactly where the resonant stops and the vowel starts. But the resonant can become voiceless, and so you can get a voiceless resonant, which is a little weird. And those ones still, even with the voiceless resonant, you can still get the contour tone on those unaccented vowel or unaccented syllables. So yeah, so I don't exactly just like you say, I've got to think through the description and think through the implications, but there's tools. And thanks for the reference to the Yiddish article. I'll look that up.
Yeah, sure. What I was highlighting there for anyone else that might be watching this is that the attachment of a consonant to a V slot is more complicated than simply here's a consonant, here's a C, and that's it. End of story. There you go.
Yeah, for sure.
You can have multiple attachments and like other things. Anyway, Noam, what do you
I don't know, Carlos, what do Moraic onsets make you think about in the languages that you know?
Well, I was thinking on Zapotec, the language I told you, well, the last session, where they proposed for Lenis Fortis, and I can buy your idea about CV with empty V slots. I do not have doubts at this point. However, how can I say this? How can I prove that they have an empty V slot, right? We have languages like Russian with those alternation between epenthetic or elisions and deletion, sorry. But how can we prove that fact, right? I'm thinking on Spanish and this Portuguese example where you have ST sequences as loan words in languages where you cannot have those sequences. And basically you have two solutions, right? Insertion before the consonant, like in Spanish, Star Wars. Or I believe that in certain Indian languages, instead you have like a E, right? Like sitar instead of star, right? And then we have perfect evidence about the possibility of having empty slots or theoretical or virtual slots. But how about those languages where you have like a really strong distribution where you cannot have like, let's say, random onsets like ST and TT or NT, right? You have only double T's. How can we prove that, right? If we don't have like processes, and that would be, that's my main question, right?
I would always say, so whenever I'm asked, well, how do you prove this, right? Or how is I'm not asked that so often, but like, okay, say one thing of whenever I run into a problem in my analysis, okay, in a strict CV analysis, then I say, well, is this only a problem of strict CV? Right? Because this CV skeleton for us is some sort of axiom, right? We're saying, what do children start with? Okay, so they start with the simplest thing, the thing that exists in every language, ba, CV, right? And then if the language tells them you have to be more complex, then they're more complex, right? In your case, in the Zapotec case, language tells them something about initial onsets, right? Tells them something about the consonant clusters that you can have or that happens. But the question is, if you did not look at it from the strict CV perspective, would it be easier? It doesn't seem, and the question is always no, right? It's not that like a general Moraic or syllabic theory is more simple or simpler than a strict CV analysis. The strict CV sort of limits you more, but I find it that it's mostly in the right direction.
So yeah, and in many languages, so to take the specific example, so to apply what Noam is saying to your stir example, like the only if you were to take standard syllable structure, what's the explanation there for why in some languages you get istar and in some languages you get sitar? Like there's no automatic, it's not like we're losing here to a better theory, is Noam's point, I think. But it's true, it happens to be true though, of course, that if the language doesn't have codas, then you are going to get sitar, right? Like, so those cases are simple, like in Africa, like you get loads of examples like that. Languages that have both codas and languages that do allow codas but still have vowel epenthesis between the S and the C, that's an interesting case. I definitely don't have anything to hand, but I haven't actually thought about it very much. I mean, it came to me though when I was. I remember thinking this as a student actually back when I was first exposed to this story. I would say obviously that they are both legitimate structures in strict CV, right? In strict CV, you have to fill something, so either you fill left or you fill right. And then as for like specific conditions, I've never studied it. I've never looked at it. I wonder if there is an actual, if you can derive it from some other factor in the language, you would assume maybe.
Farsi is interesting in this respect because Farsi does not have initial clusters at all, but it epenthesizes a vowel before an SC cluster and between other initial clusters.
Yes. Very interesting. Yeah.
For some reason, yeah. And
yeah, there may be something. There's obviously still work to be done on S plus C clusters. I mean, it's a fascinating area. There's like we were saying, what we were using that S plus C for was to show that you could have things that look like codas at the beginning of the word. And that's for us vital because because we do lead generally with the notion of phonological behavior as being like the most important consideration. So like if the S plus C sequences behave like branching onsets, if they behave like that phonologically, we would just throw out our theory of sonority or our theory of clusterhood. It would just go, right? But the fact is that they don't behave the same way. So whatever it is about, so what it shows us is that a syllable structure is not limited to onsets in initial position. Yeah.
Well, that's okay. Great. I don't know if you have time for 2 more questions.
Yeah, we can take more questions.
Okay, well, one has to do with there's an observation in Gordon's phonological typology survey. I don't know how to say this. Well, whatever.
Survey, yeah.
Survey. Okay, so he observes that even though you don't have Moraic onsets, you have a tendency within languages to the fact that stressed syllables tend to have onsets, right? And yeah, might be something unrelated. I have my own explanation, but why that pattern does not reflect on the possibility to have Moraic onsets? What's your opinion on that?
Well, vowels, so vowels in non-prominent positions, or like we've seen that in the Australian example, in the Umpitamo example, that here there is a vowel without an onset, and the way we've suggested that speakers formalize this is by saying that the vowel is weak, right? And so that can lead maybe, right, to those languages where, but the thing is that our approach is not very well equipped for these tendencies, right? And I wonder if we want to have an approach that does that, right? So you get the max ent approach that can do that. I don't think we can do it.
Thank you. And I will say that I think in the case okay, so in the historical case of the Australian languages, right, without these initial, it has been argued, I think, that the phonetics of stress in those languages tends to be more right leaning.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a general theory really of onsets being licensed by their V slot. So and onsets in general, they derive their strength from the vowel that they are the onset of. And so in general, and in strict CV, this is something we carry across everywhere. For example, like word finally, the word final consonants can be very restricted. For us, they are onsets with an MTV. Because it's an MTV and it's final, it can be different to a medial MTV. So medial and final codas don't have to have the same exact behavior, but they're both going to be weaker than a C in front of a full vowel. And so if the source of consonantal strength is ultimately a vocalic thing, which phonetically, by the way, you could imagine as being is quite natural just from the notion that like in prevocalic position, you get more of the actual phonetic structure of the consonant. Then the fact that in many languages, if you have a weak vowel, you are likely to have a weak consonant at the same time.
No consonant.
Yeah, or indeed, maybe no consonant.
This is what happened in Australian, right?
So this is what happened in Australia.
Yeah. So all of those initial weak vowels, they used to have an onset, but they weren't stressed, so they lost their onset, right? And once that's the point.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So okay, that would be an epiphenomenon, right? Not cause, but okay. And the second question has to do with the fact, and Shanti told.
Sorry. It's just because to bookend what we just said. So basically, it's what like Noam said in the talk. Like instead of saying this syllable is strong because it has an onset, it's actually it lost its onset because it's weak. Yeah. Sorry, Carlos.
Well, it doesn't have an onset because it's weak. Yeah.
No, I like that. And what the final question by my part is that we can have C's in V position, right? And that's why we have syllabic consonants, but we cannot have onset vowels, right? And
of course we can. Oh, wait.
Oh, yeah.
Of course we can. Yeah, because you have a vocalic element in an onset position. That's a glide, right?
Oh, the thing is, are glides really vowels, or are they? I don't know.
The accepted wisdom is that they are, right? The accepted wisdom, I mean, once in a while there's a paper who says, well, for this language, we have to distinguish between vowels and glides. Certainly, it's more common for A than for U and E, but it's more common for U and E to sort of vacillate between a glide and a vocalic realization, right? But many, many, many languages have analyses can be reduced to saying, well, this glide is just a vowel that precedes another vowel, and therefore the vocalization is the realization is this vowel is realized as a non-nuclear position, right? So basically your diphthong ui is just u and e, and then the e is peripheral, and that's why you get a glide. Okay. And
all right. Okay, so I'm guessing that you like particle theory or those kinds of approaches where you have
that kind of thing.
Yeah. You're right.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
we do. We really do. And we like it because it's actually the most auto-segmental analysis that you can have, actually. If you have the feature, why does the feature care what it's in? I mean, like, in a sense, a freer theory would be that features can link to both C's and V's. And then the language decides how you pronounce that combination, that set of combinations. If you don't have and the argument against that would simply be, well, we don't have any assimilation of features from C to V. But that's obviously false. Like, there are loads of languages where the assimilation is clearly between onset and vowel. And the most natural analysis would be a shared feature. So like a palatalization, for example, right? Otherwise, you have to say, like, this consonant gets this feature, let's say plus or minus anterior. It becomes suddenly minus anterior because it has plus high next to it. Well, why not say it's the E that spreads to both C and V? It's like so much easier. Yeah, so we do love that kind of theory. Yeah.
Okay, I like it though, but let's say that E it's yod, U is vowel, and A may be in Semitic languages, right? But what about A or O or schwa? Do we have media vowels in onset position? It's like a
I actually do know a language like that. So like it's Rotuman, right? So it has like this theory. It has bisyllabic sequences that become monosyllabic. There are various theories, but the a and o, any two vowels are allowed. The a and the o, when they go into that V position, they become, like Noam was saying, desyllabified. So they sound very much like a sort of glided version of an a or an o. Yeah.
But isn't that true for Spanish too? Isn't that true for Spanish too?
More or less, but I don't know which example are you thinking about.
I recently reviewed a paper about Spanish, where they argued that all vowels glide, and then there's some restrictions, but all vowels glide in spoken. So if you say no hablar, you say no hablar, no hablar, yeah, and stuff like that. There's like restrictions on when it happens, but basically every vowel can glide.
Yeah, it does glide, but well, that's, let's say,
want to say it's
an effect.
Consonant? Yeah. I
agree. Yeah. To me, if I say cielo, I may have a glide, but it's never a consonant for me, at least. Yeah.
Yeah.
A consonant phonological, sorry, not phonetically. It is. Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
No, sure, I understand that. By the way, to go back to the very first formulation of your question, I think when you it was basically, we get syllabic consonants, but what about a vowel in an onset position? Now we said, what about glides? And you could say, well, they sound different in a C position. So why is it that we don't get like something that just sounds purely like a vowel in a C? But syllabic consonants, I mean, they're not phonetically, syllabic consonants are not exactly the same as codas. in many languages, right? Like, so they do become slightly different for the fact that they're attached to a V. And so I think that that's all about phonetic implementation. I think it's the same kind of difference as, like, for example, like if your language says, like, or indeed intra-speaker variation, where you have like different levels of constriction of the glide, like, you know, like yod, 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 like how much are people constricting? So I think ultimately, I think, yes, everything can link to everything, but your language might not allow you to express a feature in a certain position. So your language might only say, I'm sorry, but the only feature I can keep from this vowel in the C position is E and U. So O will become W and E will become Y.
Yeah. But that might be a universal sonority threshold, I'm guessing, right?
But there are languages where there is no gliding after, or you know, as a because of, or next to a mid vowel, but there is gliding next to a high vowel, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So
Yeah,
it can't be universal,
No, it'll
right?
be phonological. Yeah.
Okay.
I have to say that I've recently, I don't know if I told you, Shanti, but I've recently been approached by this, I mean, recently, almost a year ago, by this guy who was working on this Papuan language, and he was saying, you know, I have a lot of pharyngeals in my language that I'm working on, like a lot of ein, right? And that's a Papuan language. It's not a Semitic language, right? And very, very clearly, the pharyngeal is a hiatus breaker before an ah, right? So just like E and U can glide, also ah can glide and give you an ah, right?
It's probably language specific, the exact nature. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Usually languages don't allow for that, but this strangely, this language from Papua New Guinea allows for that, and we're working on the analysis.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That sounds cool. Okay, well, thank you for your time again. Muchas gracias. We had a little assistance this time, but this will be, se va a quedar colgado en YouTube. I don't know if you hang the videos now, right? No.
Yeah, I'll link the video in my site if somebody wants to see it.
Yeah. Okay, so that will be all. Well, les agradecemos mucho. Pequeños anuncios para las personas que vean. Pueden escribirle a Noam y a Shanti, official, con una L silábica. Y sí, creo, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Sí. Ok, y bueno, el próximo mes, el 11 de diciembre, vamos a tener a Charles Ruiz de la Universidad de Concordia, quien va a hablar sobre fonología lógica. Y los invitamos de forma permanente a participar en este ciclo de nuevas perspectivas de fonología formal y reiterar la invitación para el Seminario Permanente de Análisis Fónicos. Será, me parece que el primer viernes de cada mes, pero bueno, pueden consultar nuestras redes sociales. Me siento como influencer haciendo esto, pero no. Para ver más información al respecto, y Noam y Shanti están siempre invitados, y de parte de Hugo y Mario, que no pudieron estar aquí, les agradezco muchísimo. La verdad fue un verdadero honor contar con ustedes, y bueno, ya nos estaremos molestando luego.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias para todo.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Que estén muy bien, Adiós.
Gracias.
Chao.
Nos vemos, bye bye.